Good morning, everyone. It is now 10:30 a.m. GMT +8, so we can begin today's session. A pleasant morning to our distinguished speakers and everyone in the audience joining us today. We are happy to see that we have a lot of participants from the industry as well as regulators here. Just a few reminders, please note that this webinar is being recorded. For questions, kindly use Zoom's Q&A function and make sure to include the name of the speaker to whom your question is directed. So with that, allow me to welcome all of you to the webinar on the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance entitled Accelerating Transition Finance in the ASEAN. I am Don Alfred Aquilisan from the Philippine Securities and Exchange Commission, and I will be your host today. The conversation on transition has and continues to gain significant traction. Over the last few years, we have seen different bodies and organizations talk about whole-of-economy transitions, where financing is essential to accelerate global decarbonization. COP29, also held last year, identified a new collective quantified goal on climate finance, tripling financing to developing countries from $100 billion to $300 billion annually by 2035. This is where frameworks such as the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance find value, so that climate change vulnerable nations, particularly in the ASEAN, can contribute to their own and to collective decarbonization goals. So with that context in mind, and with the release of the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance version 2 on October 2022-2024, today's webinar proves to be timely and relevant. To officially open the event, allow me to invite Madam Fengsi Feng Wong, Secretary General of the Lao Securities Commission Office. The chair of the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum, or ACMF 2024, Lao Securities Commission Office played a crucial role leading up to the publication of the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance version 2. Madam Fengsi earned her bachelor's degree in Vietnam and master's degree from Waseda University, Japan. Previously holding various leadership roles at the Bank of Lao PDR prior to joining as Secretary General of the Lao Securities Commission Office, her extensive experience in macroeconomic policy, financial intelligence, and international relations have proven to have significantly contributed to the advancement of Lao PDR's financial sector. So everyone, please welcome Madame Fengsi.
Thank you, Don, for a very nice introductions on myself. Well, first of all, I would like to again wish you in January Happy New Year to all of you and Honorable the ACMF Chair, Deputy WCMD, ARIM, SLC member, and relevant stakeholder, ADB and software, and distinguished and other participation. This is my very great honor to welcome you to our webinar on the ASEAN Transition Finance Guideline version 2. Well, to just recall on our launching of the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance version 2 on October 10, 2024. Sequence, we're supposed to have our today's webinar in December, but somehow given the relevance and also availability of all stakeholders, may not be do that. So we postponed today, and it's very happy that to have all of you here, and of course, thanks to the Sophia to host the meeting or the webinar to be happened today. This is very, very important webinar to discuss an essential subject on our regional sustainable development. To start my remark, I just to feel recap that we have been done on the our transition finance guideline that been released our first version in October 2023 by ACMF, and then this served at the a very credible transition in the ASEAN to facilitate access to the capital market finance, and also the support to the creations of transition labeled financial instrument as the part of the transition assets class. Follow the release of this ATFG, the ACMF conduct a consultation process from June to July 2024, engaging the key stakeholder to identify the area where the ATFG could be clarified to deeper, to more effective, credible, and practical. Based on these consultations, the ASEAN Transitions Finance guidance have been updated, and it would be the second that we're gonna discuss today, where we're gonna hear from the presentation on this second from the ACMF and our knowledge partner, Oliver Wyman, and will be followed by our panel discussion with the speaker from the ACMF, ASEAN ADB, and industry advisory panels, moderated by the Sophia, to explore the applications of the guidance to support the real economic companies and financial institutions in the creating or assessing transition plan. With that, I would like to hope that our discussion today will be very faithful and more sharing experience or very experience that we have been to our first version, and we now go to the amendment and update on the second version. We look forward for a very productive discussion, and thank you very much for your participation today. I will stop here. Hand over to you, Dan.
Thank you so much, Madam Feng Si, for opening the webinar and for warmly welcoming our participants today. It is indeed an honor to know the effort and work put into have the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance version 2. But before we start, may I please invite our speakers and panelists to turn on their cameras for a quick group photo session. May I request the webinar secretariat to take the screenshots, please. Okay, in 3, 2, 1, smile. Thank you so much, speakers and panelists. You may turn off your videos now. Moving on to the next portion of today's webinar, we have a presentation by the ACMF on the brief background of the ACMF's transition initiative and an overview of the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance, as well as key changes to version 2 released last year. To give the presentation, allow me to welcome Mr. Khairul Rizwan Abdul Kudus, General Manager of International Affairs from the Chair of the ACMF 2025 and the Co-Chair of the ACMF Sustainable Finance Working Group, Securities Commission Malaysia. As General Manager, Khairul's role includes work in advancing financial integration among ASEAN jurisdictions. He is involved in developing sustainable finance initiatives for the ASEAN capital markets through SE Malaysia's co-chairmanship of the ACMF Sustainable Finance Working Group, as well as the Infrastructure Finance Working Group of the ASEAN Working Committee on Capital Market Development. Khairul is also SE Malaysia's alternate board member to the ASEAN Taxonomy Board. Alongside, we will also have a guest presenter by the ACMF's knowledge partner for the ATFG version 2, Oliver Wyman, represented by Ms. Chiaki Tampubolon. Chiaki is a principal in Oliver Wyman, Singapore, focusing on climate and sustainability as well as digital banking. Over the years, she has helped multiple banks in Southeast Asia on an array of climate areas, including climate risk management and net zero target operationalization. She also leads Oliver Wyman's climate work in Indonesia. So to begin the presentation, allow me to hand over the floor to Khairul and Chiaki.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Don. Could we have the slide presentations on screen, please? Thank you very much. So good morning, Secretary General, Madam Feng Wong of Lao Securities Commission Office, distinguished chairs and members of the ACMF, esteemed speakers, ladies and gentlemen of the audience. So if we could go on to the next two slides, please. So today I and Jackie of Oliver Wyman will take you through the I think an overview of the ASEAN transition finance guidance, both a recap of version 1 and the changes that we've introduced in version 2. And Jackie will also give I think a brief overview of the stakeholder consultations and how it framed and influenced the development of version 2. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. Firstly, let's get into some background on the importance of transition finance in ASEAN. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So where this starts is, I think, overall sustainable finance initiatives as done by the capital market regulators. And in this regard, the ACMF started with I think in 2016, we set up a group, or a sustainable finance working group. The first project then was the development of green bond standards for ASEAN. So, in fact, the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, which was based on ICMA's Green Bond Principles, was issued in 2017. This was followed by the Social and Sustainability Bond Standards in 2018. And I think notably the Sustainability-Linked Bond Standards in 2022. So I think if you've noticed, I think while the initial initiatives dealt with I think use of proceeds bonds, which catered to green and social projects and initiative. 2022's development of the SLB standards, which looked at financing for general purposes to assist entities or companies on a transition journey. That was, I think, one of the major initiatives, in fact, that had a transition element. But even before the standards that were issued in 2022, in 2020, both the ACMF and the Working Committee on Capital Market Development of ASEAN issued sustainable roadmaps and reports for the capital market. And in these reports, as well as the work plans for the sustainable finance working groups of both these entities, the need for a transition guidance was identified. So I think the importance was identified very early in that sense. So if you could go on to the next slide, please. So in recognition of the different states of development of the countries, both within ASEAN as well as between the ASEAN markets and more developed markets, the need for a just transition was a key consideration in planning the sustainability agenda. And we recognize that in the region, the dependence on fossil fuels remains quite high, and the availability of renewable energy varies between countries in ASEAN, different types. You see, potential wind power in Vietnam, hydropower in Malaysia, Cambodia, Laos. So different types of RE, but of course the dependence on fossil fuels is there. And transitioning from these main sources of power would have social and economic impacts among the population. And this was recognized, the need for a just transition in these publications I mentioned earlier. So if you could go on to the next slide, please. So in relation to moving on to the transition guidances, in the past few years, there have been various transition guidances globally which the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance took into account in its development. In September 2020, CBI and Credit Suisse issued a white paper on financing credible transition. So this was born out of a need for some clarity, as some bond issuers which did not qualify as green were using a transition label, which was not entirely consistent between issuances. So subsequent to that, transition was addressed also in various guidances issued by PRI, GFANS, G20, OECD, and so on. So this clearly demonstrated the need and interest to provide some structure for transition among these various international organizations, FI associations, and so on. So where ASEAN was concerned, we developed the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance, and version 1 was launched in October 2023. Next slide, please. So this slide just shows the status of nationally determined contributions of the ASEAN countries. All ASEAN countries have made such commitments, and many have set targets for carbon neutrality and net zero as well. So although as a region, ASEAN does not have a regional NDC or net zero, the guidance is flexible enough to help the countries of ASEAN chart their transition pathway to achieve these targets. Next slide, please. And a customized approach for every ASEAN country is all the more important given the different starting points for emissions across the region. And energy demand across the region continues to grow, and a lot of this is still fossil fuels. RE is a fraction of the total energy supply. So in terms of fossil fuel, it dominates the supply, accounting for 83%. And in 2021, energy supply reached approximately 1.6 times compared to 2005. Oil is the major fuel supply, accounting for around 32%. And electricity generation continues to increase, with an average of 5% increase from 2016 to 2021, dominated by coal and gas. And coal remains the highest among the fuel sources, with 42% share of electricity generation in 2021. So that's it for, I think, the background to the ecosystem or the state of play in ASEAN. If we could go on to the next slide, I'll provide a recap of what we introduced in the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance version 1. Next slide, please. So the guidance and I think just as a bit of a background to this, in terms of version 1 and version 2, many of the elements of version 1 remain, and what we've done in version 2 is to provide further clarification and further tools to enhance the usability of the guidance. So as a recap, the intention of the guidance is to define principles by which one may assess a company's transition credibility at an entity level, and also to provide guidance on how to make use of relevant climate-oriented resources to facilitate transition planning. And through this, the ACMF hopes that financial institutions can accelerate efforts to direct finance to companies that wish to transition. And for the companies themselves, we hope they are encouraged to create more ambitious and credible transition plans. So I think as they say, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step, and we certainly do not want the expectation of a high ambition to deter companies from starting their transition journey. So we hope the guidance can be a basis for firstly issuing transition labeled financing instruments, bonds, and so on, and also providing financing that supports transition and build a fundamental climate transition capabilities. Next slide, please. So how the guidance does this is by meeting the demands of investors while reflecting the pace of transition of real economy participants, the companies itself in the region. It is also based on international transition finance guidelines to ensure interoperability, some of them which I think I mentioned earlier in the presentation. It should be attainable for ASEAN issuers, and it addresses how entities may assess or demonstrate a credible transition in ASEAN. A key objective in developing the guidance is to define principles that recognize that different parts of the world will transition at different paces and different times. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is a recap of encapsulated in this slide is how the guidance works. So the main purpose of the guidance is to assess transition credibility, and transition credibility consists of two main elements, as you can see in the left-hand column and the middle column, which is sufficient climate ambition and the robustness of the company's ability to deliver on the ambition. So to establish the first part, which is climate ambition, there are three factors. Firstly, to determine the state, current state of the company, assessing all emissions from environmentally material business activities, scopes 1 and 2 emissions, of course, but scope 3 where material, which can serve as ground zero or the foundation for the forward-looking plans. The next is to select a transition pathway. So there are several reference pathways according to sectors globally, and the entity should choose a pathway consistent with the Paris Agreement. And the suitability based on the company's business is important, as well as bearing in mind the geographical nuances applicable to the company. And perhaps most important, targets should be set for transition. So this should be time-bound, very firm, and absolute emission targets must show a trajectory equivalent or more ambitious, to the reference pathways. So the second element is the robustness of the ability to deliver. And here, the elements are having a sound implementation strategy, governance in the company to ensure this happens. Disclosure is also important. Companies should disclose their performance targets and progress at the minimum on an annual basis. Verification is encouraged, third-party verification to ensure transition credibility. And of course, considerations for a just transition should be put into place as well. And I think what is unique for the guidance is that there are 3 tiers to meaningfully represent the differences in ambition and market expectations. So these 3 tiers represent the difference in approaches of transitioning entities. Firstly is aligned and aligning to a 1.5 degrees Celsius target under the Paris Agreement. Second is aligned and aligning to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And the third caters for those which do not which demonstrate most but not all elements of the ability to deliver on an ambition that is aligned to well below 2 degrees Celsius. So companies that are not at that stage yet fall into this category, and they should have committed to addressing any material omissions in the next 2 years. So if you could go on to the next slide. So I think that's it for the recap of version 1. So for the next stage, I'd like to call upon our knowledge partner, Oliver Wyman, Ms. Jackie, to take us through the outcomes of the stakeholder consultation. Jackie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Carol. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and also share on the back of the stakeholder consultations that we held after the publication of version 1. So if we can get to the next couple of slides. We held consultations with different market participants to gather sufficient feedback on the first version of the transition finance guidance. We had interviewed banks, rating agencies, and other financial institutions, where we asked open-ended questions in general to get their inputs on version 1, but also slightly more targeted questions so that we can understand the usefulness of the guidance and where we can take it further, as Kyril said, to improve on the usability, right? So some of those areas were around, accreditation, should we actually look to define transition finance as tradable asset class? We wanted to understand the interoperability of the document itself. Do they think that it was sort of suitable given the standards that are out there? We also looked at, in general, like the 3 tiers that were produced. Did they find that to be appropriate? And I think the sort of high-level overview is that the guidance itself was sufficient. The challenge towards adoption is more around the ambition of corporates or the relevant companies to determine their climate ambition and transition. However, when it came to the principles that were outlined in the within the version 1, the principles were quite robust and quite clear, right? The principles and the guidance that were outlined were also sufficiently interoperable. However, in general, where after all the stakeholder consultations, we converged around sort of 2 areas that the stakeholders sort of brought up. The first one is that they raised the sort of concern around different interpretations of transition finance that they found when having discussions within the industry. Sometimes this term was, interpreted differently. It could be interpreted as, green finance or sustainable finance. So in order to sort of ease some of the discussions in the market, we found that potentially it could be worth just defining what is actually transition finance, or how do we see transition finance applications within the industry. That is the first one. The second one, what they raised was around the reference pathways. So when it came to the reference pathways that are out there, a lot of these pathways are typically global. So when different real economy companies within Asia and Southeast Asia would like to actually set their targets and set their pathways, they found that it was not quite suitable. So actually they raised the fact that maybe it could be helpful to actually try and get more guidance on how to localize, on how to augment some of these pathways, so that they can create suitable transition pathways for each of their companies. In the next slide, so that helped us get an understanding of where we should move forward when it came to version 2. So the principles remain the same. However, what we thought would be useful was to augment version 2 with these 2 key areas. The first one is to clarify the different types and definitions of transition finance, to get to a unified understanding among the market participants, and articulate what a credible transition plan for ASEAN entities would be by giving more guidance when it came to the pathways that would be representative for their companies. So within the augmentation of the pathways, then we look at how to potentially augment it from a geographical standpoint, from a business operational type standpoint, so that the company setting these pathways would be more comfortable with what they're actually targeting. Back to you, Kyril.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Jackie. So we proceed with an overview of the new version 2. If you could go on to the next slide, please. So I think this was what Jackie covered in her last slide as well, following I think what the stakeholders intimated that they wanted to see in version 2. The ACMF included these elements of I think a clarification as to the definition of a transition finance and more clarity as to how a credible transition plan looks like, more examples of how to more examples of representative pathways, use cases, and so on. So if you could go on to the next slide, I'll elaborate further on this. So this is the first part relating to the definition of transition finance. What we feel is that the type of finance used, whether it's bonds, borrowings, or so on, should not be the defining characteristic of transition finance. However, it's useful to distinguish the application of the finance to clarify the understanding between market participants. So the three types applications are what you see on screen here. Firstly, green finance, which is finance provided to specific green activities or assets with low to zero emissions in alignment with agreement. The second is asset level transition finance, which is finance provided to activities which could contribute towards decarbonization in the short term, which does not necessarily reach the green level yet. So in a nutshell, transition activities. And the third is entity level transition finance, which is general use finance provided to companies which are undergoing a transition process. I think if any of you who are familiar with bonds, for example, so the first two relate to use of proceeds kind of financing, where the nature of the activity or project that you plan to finance will dictate the eligibility for that kind of finance. So these are activity level financing. But the third is sort of general purpose, and you see this in sustainability linked bonds, where I think the importance is placed on targets, KPIs, and the existence of a transition plan. So I think in version 1, perhaps there was a lot of things were implicitly made in version 1, but the clarity as to the definitions provide this more certainty to market participants. So when we say green finance here, I think it's important to distinguish that even companies, because we are talking about entity level transition in the guidance. So as part of that transition, the company could undertake or purchase assets or projects that are pure green in nature. It doesn't mean that the company is green yet, but the project could be green that will help it to along its transition journey to net zero and to meet its targets. So it could be a green project, it could be a transition project. So these are what the first two address. But the third addresses specifically financing for the entity itself, where you don't necessarily have to demonstrate that you're using the proceeds for a particular green or amber purpose. Suffice it to say that because you have that transition plan, the purposes of the proceeds are being used to meet the objectives of that plan in one way or another. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So this is an example of this in practice, although it is a fictional use case. So a company, for example, a power generation company, traditionally fossil fuel based, but is trying to transition to renewable energy. So when it develops a solar farm to add onto its portfolio, that is an example of the first category, a green finance project. It may to replace its fleet of coal-fired power plants. Number one, it retires some of these coal-fired power plants. Again, it's an activity-based transition activity, and it may acquire some gas-fired power plants as a transitionary measure. So these again fall within the second category I mentioned just now. But over and above all that, the company may want to raise finance as part of this transition journey. So that is the third category, which is transition finance, which do not have a specific purpose, but are used for general purposes. So if you go on to the next slide, please. I think I'm mindful of time, and you must be really looking forward to the exciting panel session next. So the next is the next important aspect that it was introduced in version 2 is clarity on the reference pathway selection and also augmentation. So version 2 provides a playbook to help address the challenge in selecting or augmenting suitable pathways. So it does this through a list of available reference pathways for each sector, with a view of most widely accepted pathways globally, some of them being used in ASEAN already by financial institutions. And secondly, it sets out some principles to augment the pathways to match the operations of the company planning to use them, and also the geographical nature of the issuer, because the pathway may not exactly match the situations of scenario of the issuer. If you could go on to the next slide, please. So in terms of the list of reference pathways, the guidance version to list down the pathways, publishers of pathways typically used in ASEAN. We have the International Energy Agency, or the IEA, which is being used for power, agriculture, vehicles, coal, and so on. The International Maritime Organization, there is a whole list of these reference pathways covering various sectors such as steel, aluminum, cement, real estate, oil and gas, power, among others. And you can see this list on pages 35 and 36 of the guidance. So this helps entities identify the most suitable pathway for the company. Next slide, please. And the next part of it is the augmentation of the pathway. So you may not necessarily need to use the pathway as it is stated, and this augmentation has, I think, 4 elements on how to augment the pathways. Firstly, to try to match the scope of emissions of the reference pathway with material emissions from the sector. So the company should ensure that the emissions covered by the pathway is in alignment of its own business. And the second is in terms of business activities, the chosen pathway should cover all activities pertinent to the company's operations. The coverage of GHG types, so the types of emissions identified should match the ones that are involved in the company's operations. And last but certainly not least, the nuances as to the company's location, geography, and so on. Some of these pathways may be tailored globally, but you should find one that is suitable for the ASEAN region and for your country. So if you go on to the next slide, please, we'll just briefly take you through two of the case studies that are in the guidance itself. So this case study shows how such a pathway is augmented. So in this particular case, the company concerned is an automotive um, uh, is in the automotive sector. So the IEA has an NZE or net zero pathway for the automotive sector. And, the thing about the IEA's pathway is that I think it assumes a certain level of involvement of legacy vehicles, those with internal combustion engines, for example. So this company in particular is a bit more progressive. So it has, in terms of sales, a more, I suppose, aggressive portfolio in terms of electric vehicles. So it uses, it can augment or modify the pathway to take into account its own portfolio of sales. So perhaps focusing more on the EV type of vehicles that it has, whether it's hybrid EVs or pure battery EVs and so on. So in this particular case, if you can see on the right side of the screen, the dark blue line is the pathway of IEA, but the lighter blue line is the pathway which is more aggressive, which starts out at a lower emissions base to reflect the company's situation. So that's one case of how it's, a pathway is augmented to suit the company's more ambitious transition plan. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So the next slide is in relation to a power generation company. And similarly, IEA has an NZE pathway for the energy sector. And in this particular case, the company regionalizes the pathway to suit Southeast Asia. And this is done by using the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario, SDS, as a proxy. So as opposed to the previous slide, what we see here is that the company's pathway starts out at a higher base of emissions, going down towards, I think, the same target, but at a steeper route. So in fact, this is the approach taken by the ASEAN taxonomy as well in looking at or setting the amber tiers for the power sector. It does look at the IEA SDS scenario. So I think that takes us to the end of this overview of the ATFG, both versions 1 and 2, and what we've done based on stakeholder consultation to develop the second version. The guidance itself is available on the ACMF website as well as the SOFIA website. Please have a more detailed read because we don't think we could have covered everything in half an hour. So thank you. Thank you for your attention, and I'll pass the floor back to Dawn for the next segment. Thank you.
Thank you, Khairul and Chiaki, for giving our participants an overview of the ACMF's transition efforts, as well as key principles of and changes to the guidance. As mentioned by Khairul, you may get a copy of the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance version 2 at the ACMF website as well as the Sustainable Finance Institute Asia's website. We have also provided links in the chat. The ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance version 2 is a product of careful and meticulous study of the views of relevant stakeholders on the first version. Khairul and Chiaki mentioned earlier that there are two key changes to version 2 of the guidance. So we move on to today's panel session for a deeper dive on the changes incorporated into the version 2 of the guidance to further emphasize its relevance to meet national, regional, and global decarbonization targets. To moderate this session is Mr. Eugene Wong, Chief Executive Officer of the Sustainable Finance Institute, or SOFIA. Eugene is CEO of Sophia, an independent institute established to catalyze ideas on sustainable finance at the policy level in ASEAN, as well as propel action in support of those policy ideas. Sophia is currently host of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board. Prior to becoming its CEO, Eugene was previously the Managing Director of Corporate Finance and Investments of the Securities Commission Malaysia. Joining Eugene is a panel of experts. First is Commissioner McGill Bryant Fernandez from the Philippine Securities and Exchange Commission. Commissioner Bryant is the Supervising Commissioner of the Markets and Securities Regulation Department of PSEC. PSEC is currently the ACMF Vice Chair and co-chairs the ACMF Sustainable Finance Working Group and chairs the ACMF Working Group on Corporate Governance. He's also a board member of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board. Prior to joining PSEC, Commissioner Bryant served as Deputy Executive Secretary for General Administration under the Office of the President of the Republic of the Philippines. Also joining the panel is Mr. Peter Rosenkrantz, Senior Financial Sector Specialist in the Finance Sector Office of the Asian Development Bank. His focus is on finance sector operations in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, leading lending projects, technical assistance, and knowledge solutions. He's also the ADB's focal point for collaboration with the ACMF. Peter previously served as an economist in ADB's Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department. We also have in the panel Ms. Monica Bay, Director of Investor Practice at the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change. She manages collaborative engagement with investors in Asia to build capacity and integrate climate-related issues in investment processes, and to increase capital flow into decarbonization to align with the 1.5 degrees future. Monica also currently sits as a member of the Industry Advisory Panel of the Joint Sustainable Finance Working Group of the ACMF and the Working Committee on Capital Market Development. She also brings 16 years of experience in financial services and economic research. And to complete today's panel members, we have Mr. Shivanan Sivaraha, Head of Project Finance Asia of the MUFG Bank. The business provides non-recourse debt solutions for power, oil, and gas, as well as infrastructure clients and investors across the ASEAN region. Shiv has been a banker for 25 years in Europe and Asia, giving a wide range of experience in different disciplines, including project or structured finance and advisory, debt capital markets, and mergers and acquisition, among others. So with that, allow me to hand over the floor to Eugene to facilitate the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Don, for the very kind introduction. Panelists, thank you very much for making time to join us today. Your experience and insights will certainly be very valuable, and I'm sure everyone will agree with me that Khairul and Jackie did an excellent job introducing the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance version 2 in a very, very short time. So before we dive into the ATFG version 2, I actually wanted to talk a bit about the state of play for transition. So we're seeing a number of different challenges coming from different directions at the same time. I mean, on one hand, 2024 was the hottest year on record, and the first year where the global average temperature actually exceeded 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels. Although fortunately, the long-term warming still remains a little bit below that. But CO2 emissions were at a record high, and at the rate we're going to hit 3.1 degrees in 2100. The number of climate-related natural disasters has also increased. We've seen it even in the LA. And of course, we also see things like political shifts to the right, underpinned by cost of living issues, competitiveness, and geopolitical events. So climate change seems to have dropped a bit on the priorities list. And some FIs also exiting climate action groups. So it's really important for us to set the context for this discussion and ask, is transition still important and why? And perhaps, Peter, ADB is at the forefront of trying to bring sustainable development into the region. What do you think?
Thank you, Eugene, and good morning, colleagues. First of all, it's a real privilege to be part of this esteemed panel to discuss the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance version 2, which ADB has proudly supported in partnership with the ACMF. But let me first briefly discuss the impacts of climate change. As mentioned by the introductory remarks, they're really increasingly evident, but also particularly in Asia and the Pacific, which is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world, and also home to more than half global greenhouse gas emissions. hence, I mean, the region which ultimately decides the fate of the battle against climate change. We can say that. We see increasing adverse impacts from climate change, disasters, and ongoing environmental damage. As mentioned, we also see, we witnessed the hottest year last year on record, more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And if we continue that path, quite likely that we would considerably exceed the 2 degrees even in the future. But in terms of costs, so ADB has recently estimated cost rate with climate change and suggest if this high emission path persists, the region could see GDP reduced by up to 17% by 2070. So it's kind of a long-term estimate, and as much as by 41% by 2100. Hence, there are massive economic costs associated that are also affecting and especially affecting poor and vulnerable segments of the population, including also women and girls. So to tackle these as a development bank and as Asia and the Pacific's climate bank, ADB is really committed to supporting its development member countries in promoting green and sustainable finance and crucially mobilize climate finance that is needed. We have an ambitious target to deliver at least $100 billion cumulatively in climate finance by 2030 by our own resources, but of course also through partnerships and other engagements, mobilize more with our partners, because we need a lot more. So there's various estimates out there. For example, McKinsey estimates a required annual $9.2 trillion in capital spending annual to achieve net zero by 2050, underpinning really the vast needs. So there's no shoulder from ADB, any government or any country wide enough to cover this. So we all need to work collectively together in a holistic approach. And the private sector is really important. And therefore, I would also like to end my brief remark here that the strong partnership with the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum, trying to develop sustainable capital markets in the region, including crowding in private sector climate finance, is really, really crucial and a very, very good example, including to supporting a transition. Let me stop here, Eugene, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for reminding us how real climate change is and what the impact is going to be for us, Peter. And you mentioned the ACMF, so let me move on to the ACMF. Commissioner Brian, thank you very much for being here today. So the regulator's still optimistic and committed?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you, Eugene. And it's also like to echo my thanks to Sophia for allowing or hosting this platform to be able to allow us, the ACMF, to share our initiatives, especially in the field of transition finance and climate finance. And also thank you to Don for hosting this event. Now, given the context that you've mentioned and the remarks of Peter on the costs related to how to address effects of climate change, and of course, I'm also wearing my regulator's hat, and not only because I'm a member of the ACMF, but I respond and advance the position that it's a resounding yes, that it is important and it's very much relevant. More than ever, I think it's important that we prioritize efforts that we ensure that no one is left behind, and not just efforts on climate change mitigation, but also focusing on the transition efforts. And of course, key to this is directing finance to promote green, not just green, but also near green activities and support decarbonization of emission-intensive sectors. Now, I am saying this again. I am saying this is relevant not because I'm a part of the formulation of the ATFG, but you see, ASEAN has approached this on a very practical, realistic, needs-based manner in a part of the world that is very much exposed to, say, natural phenomenon from the Pacific Ocean and very much close to the equator. And speaking from the Philippines, where we have ranked for the past 3 years as #1 in terms of being prone to disasters, climate change action is still very much relevant. And precisely, we want to move. And in the context of the ASEAN, we want to move together. And that's why we at the ACMF regulators have pooled resources We have top development partners. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, ADB, to be able to operationalize transition finance principles. We also want to tap our stakeholders, our constituents in our respective jurisdiction. And I think the respective efforts of our own jurisdictions, our national governments, we being part of a bigger ecosystem, says a lot that it's very much important and it's very much relevant in our respective jurisdictions. Just a case in point, the Philippines in the last COP has committed to come up with our just transition roadmap by the 30th COP. And we have tapped other government agencies to build on this roadmap and to really stress the point that from the Philippines, maybe for the region in general, this is very much relevant and important to today's world.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think the important point you raised is that ASEAN actually has set for itself a realistic but credible ambition. So it has always been trying to achieve something which is achievable and, of course, is not going to cause any social or economic dislocations. And so we also see this issue about maybe the repositioning that some of the FIs are taking, particularly in the US. And I wanted to turn to Monica and Shiv to ask how investors are actually responding to the current situation and how committed they continue to be, as well as how the FIs are seeing it. So perhaps I can ask Monica to share a bit about the investors first and then move on to Shiv with the FIs.
Right. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Eugene. Thank ACMF and Sophia for having me on this panel and to being able to bring forward the investors' view to this discussion as well. So AIGCC, Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, we work with investors in this region, investing into this region. These are asset owners and asset managers, and representing about 28 trillion USD in terms of assets under management. Now, I want to start off with the significance of why investors are so crucially looking into climate change as well. So I can bring in some examples as well of how investors have started off looking at the portfolio level and the exposures and what effects climate change has to the portfolio as well. So the examples can be specifically public documents that have been shared, analysis that have been shared by the asset owners from Asia regions as well. So one has come up mentioning, and these are the scenarios that the portfolios would be at 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and 3 degrees. And there are some other scenarios as well. But some have come up and mentioning very much to some of the economic cost and effects that was mentioned, about 17% difference in the outcome in the long term on the portfolios directly. Some others have come up and estimated on the varying degrees of the degrees around 0.5 to more than 1% annualized impact on the portfolios, and these are negative impacts on the portfolios from the direct impact of climate, and including that as a risk factor. You may seem a little not so significant if you think about 1% analyzed, but if you look in the long term of 30 years, 50 years, 70 years and plus, you're looking at significant 30%, 50%, 70% impact over the long run. And this is why for investors, especially those who look at and have positions on the longer term horizon, whether it's pension fund, the government funds, as well as the insurers, is really critical for them to include climate into a factor when they're investing. The second point I want to bring in is the targets that are set by the investors. So these are targets from these analysis, targets that are set by investors for themselves. So this is independent of what is going on in some of the other markets as well, is that when setting targets, there's elements of reduction, emissions reduction, and targets around that. But that's not only the targets that are set, there's also targets that are set in increasing investments towards climate solutions towards supporting the transition of the economies as well. And these targets are increasing just from our own analysis from last year, where we saw about this is an analysis of across 200 plus investors across Asia alone. These are based investors based in Asia. We roughly say about 12% had set targets on increasing capital, but that has significantly increased over this past year to 34%. So it's more than doubled over the past year, and we probably see that trend going up as well.
Thank you. That's really encouraging, and it's also important to understand there's a good economic rationale in terms of how you invest with a sustainability agenda. Shiv, how are the FIs responding?
Thank you, Eugene. Firstly, can you hear me loud and clear?
Perfectly, thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Hello, everybody, and Happy New Year. I don't know if I'm too late to say that, but again, a big thank you for letting me speak on this important forum. Great question, great opening question, and obviously I can't speak for all FIs, and I think most people have heard the news that certain institutions, particularly in the US, have pulled out of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. That's caused some ripples in terms of whether or not the commitments are the same for banks and financial institutions globally. I'll give you a perspective. Firstly, the answer to that is I don't think you should spend too much time worrying about those pullouts. That's my first point. The second point is I don't think it's going to have enormous impact on the transition or in terms of the development of banks towards focusing on supporting the energy transition. And the reason I'll say that is, firstly, we think there are two major super cycles happening. And one of those super cycles is the energy transition. And that this has started probably over a decade ago. And it's picked up enormous pace in the last 5 years. Admittedly, a lot of the policy and a lot of rules and a lot of taxonomy started only really taking off in the last 3 or 4 years. And maybe we're not seeing some of the progress we'd like to see in various aspects of that. But if you actually look at the development of technology and the rollout of renewables all over the world, Asia included, ASEAN included, that's not stopping. And that's not being impacted in any way. We, for instance, my area is largely project finance. We do a lot in energy. The vast majority of our pipeline is in renewables, whether it's offshore wind or solar or even some of the newer things with hydrogen and ammonia. That's where all the focus is. So the real economy is very much investing into that space. But the second super cycle that we see affecting the world is digitalization. And again, I probably don't have to spend too much time explaining that, because anyone who picks up a newspaper or looks at what's going on is constantly hearing about AI, data centers, and just generally the increased push to I guess, change the way we operate and the way the world works. Now, those two super cycles are important because they actually intersect, and the intersection is power, right? So the energy transition is really at its heart about the changing of power systems and making them cleaner and obviously more environmentally friendly. And digitalization is just increasing power demand all over the world. And this is important because in ASEAN, there is generally been accepted that there's an increasing requirement for power and electricity, because obviously ASEAN is growing, the economy is growing, and therefore the power demands are growing. But in a lot of the Western nations, for a long time, power demands were quite stagnant. Well, Western nations are now seeing increase in power demand. Even the US is talking about a 1-2% increase in power demand per year, which is massive when you consider the size of the power market. Now, that increase in power demand, most observers and players recognize has to be done with clean power, right? So ultimately, if you look at big tech, wherever they're going in the world, including in ASEAN, they're saying we need more power, right, to power our data centers and the other systems required for driving digitalization, but we need that power to be clean. And we're happy to help to make that clean. However, they are being very pragmatic about it. Right, they're looking at gas, they're looking at nuclear, they're looking at maybe some of the technologies that perhaps were considered a little bit more controversial. And I actually think that spells a good opportunity for ASEAN, because as Brian pointed out earlier, and as Eugene has pointed out, ASEAN's always had a pragmatic view on how the transition should go. So from a macro perspective, I actually think this is a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity for ASEAN, and it's a great opportunity for this taxonomy as we move forward.
Thank you very much. So it is quite interesting because I've had conversations with several people, and one of the key themes I'm getting is that perhaps this is really ASEAN's time, because ASEAN's baseline was set at a very practical level, and perhaps there can be convergence with the ASEAN baseline from the global baseline. So it is an opportune time, and it's really assuring to hear what all of you have said. Because the ATFG then is an important element for transitions, which again is inevitable. So I just want to dive back into the ATFG version 2, and Chiaki shared about the areas for improvement which stakeholders were consulted on. And I think those are really, really important areas. So I wanted to circle back a bit and maybe get Commissioner Brian to share from the ACMF perspective on the things they were seeking feedback on and how those responses were received and eventually incorporated into the ATFG version 2.
Thanks, Eugene. Yeah, indeed, maybe my response would largely echo what Shaki presented and what Khairul presented earlier. When we tested the version 1 of the ATFG through open questions to market participants. And with these open questions, we were able to arrive at certain issues where value could be added. Number one is, of course, on definition of transition finance and in relation to certification for asset class creation. Precisely in the absence of a unified definition, financial institutions develop their respective interpretations of transition finance. And while this ambiguity led to a low appetite for certification of a strictly defined tradable asset class in transition finance, there is still a recognition by stakeholders that second party opinion could enhance the credibility of their respective or the entities' transition plans. For example, because of the ambiguity of definitions, some FIs have provided financing to specific assets only when coupled with credible corporate level transition plans. And so we view this as having clearly defined definitions would result in broader application and maybe more take-up from industry players. On the second item on augmentation of pathways for ASEAN contextualization, we do recognize that many science-based reference pathways to net zero lack the granularity and localization need to account for the respective context of our AMS. Financial institutions, on the other hand, hesitate to define their reference pathways to avoid, of course, accusations of greenwashing. However, while aligning with region and sector-specific pathways are ideal, we believe that the lack of detail should not hinder companies from developing transition plans or from accessing transition finance. For example, I think Khairul partly touched on this. The International Energy Agency's net zero emission scenario pathway for the steel sector only covers scope 1 emissions. But for ASEAN companies that want to decarbonize the steelmaking process, which involves high use of electricity, the company may want to augment the pathway to include scope 2 emissions. On transition tiers, we do recognize that other guidelines define separate transition tiers for entities that are already aligned with or below the reference pathways before versus aligning entities whose emissions are above the reference pathways. But for stakeholders, and we do agree with this, precisely rooted from the pragmatic approach of the ASEAN, we believe that retaining the tiers is critical for finance to flow to both aligned and aligning companies to enable all their transition plans. Precisely, we want to give them flexibility. On international operability, we did recognize that there are variations between the ATFG and other guidelines, but it's pleasing to note that it has been recognized by stakeholders that the ATFG is broadly consistent with global standards across key areas. Of course, differences are largely aimed to that the ATFG is fit for the intended purpose in the ASEAN. So we came up with a recognition that version 2 should be developed in line with the need to clearly define transition finance and illustrate what a credible transition plan for ASEAN entities should look like, something which Khairul has discussed earlier. So I end here for now.
Thank you very much, Combri. I think those were very rich enhancements. And it's what you said just now, the intention to have the ATFG version 2 fit for the intended purpose. I think that's really critical because if you look at the ATFG version 2 itself, there's a table comparing the different global pathways that are being used and how many of them actually address Southeast Asia as a region or even countries within Southeast Asia. And that's really, really quite scant. So it is important for the ATFG to be contextualized, to be able to help our 71 million MSMEs as well as the large companies in the region. Monica and Shiv, I understand that the both of you were also involved in providing feedback for the ATFG version 2, and I wanted to get your views on how the issues that you identified or were interested in were actually finally addressed in the ATFG. Monica, maybe we can start with you.
Yes, thank you so much. I think overall it was very welcome. So we did give very detailed technical feedback to your team. So very welcome to see those implemented and included in the 2.0 version. I would like to mention a little bit of how, so you talked about the opportunities that are laid out in ASEAN today right now. And within that, the context would be looking at the domestic capital markets, but also the international capital markets coming into and being investable into the ASEAN region as well. So from my perspective, where we work with many of the regional and global investors who are investing into Asia, it was a bit more closer to some of the targets and alignment criteria that the investors and targets that they have already set and the views that they already have. So it was very welcome to see that. And I would like to touch upon some of the definition especially and how that aligns to some of the frameworks that the investors are using. So at this current point, also about globally, the investors who have set net zero targets, about 60% of them are using something called the net zero investment framework. There are several frameworks out there. They all try to achieve the similar elements. But one of the components of this target is the alignment of companies. And there is that flexibility within that framework, which is that has the global element, but also the flexibility to adjust the pathways and the regional nuances from the markets when the investors are actually investing in a region as well. So bringing that together, I thought was very, very interesting. The element of the three transition finance definition, I just like to touch upon that because that comes out quite a bit in our engagement with high emitting companies from the region as well. So one of the key elements that when we are looking into, so there's the green and asset level and entity level. And when we are engaging with the companies, many times the companies kind of come up and say that they have set the targets on the long term, but also it needs to be incorporated back into how it's set in the medium and short term as well. So for example, you had mentioned about steel or power generation, when even if it is a green labeled, financing per se for the transition of the company, then the investors would want to understand how this fits in with the overall strategy of that decarbonization strategy of the company as well. So it is quite important to have an overall plan and to see how these financing can fit in within that as well. So just to elaborate a little bit more on top of the definition that was explained, I think that comes into a lot of the discussions with the companies when we go into the markets. The other element, especially under, like, we have a utilities engagement program and CA 100 Climate Action 100 Plus, where we engage with high emitting companies, is the market nuances. So these pathway examples are very useful. There will be further discussions as we develop, especially the inclusion of just transition. So we have a now working group just looking on the emerging markets of Asia and how just transition will play a big role into the decarbonization as well. So all of these elements that we have mentioned on the tiers, as well as the certification, I would say, is another critical element that has been asked by many investors in developing and enabling development of the products as well.
Thank you very much, Malika. Shiv?
Yeah, no, thank you. Firstly, I'd say that I think it's a real credit to everyone involved with the ASEAN taxonomy today, including the transition finance guidance. It's a real credit in terms of the way this has been developed, because this has not been an easy thing to do. And one of the biggest risks, and I've discussed it before with some of the members, is that you create a beautiful taxonomy that nobody can use, or very, very few players can use. And I think that's been something which everyone's been very conscious of. And to that end, there's been great efforts to seek stakeholder feedback and to seek to actually evolve something that actually brings everyone along. And bringing everyone along, I always sort of use the metaphor of a train. If a train's going past the platform and it's going past very quickly, then very few people will be able to get on. But if the train is going at a nice slow speed, people can get on, and then the train can afford to speed up a bit later. And that's how I see the tiers. When I look at the tiers, which I know were subject to a great deal of debate and discussion, they're really important because they really give everybody a chance to get involved and get on board. And that's very, very critical, because as Eugene already mentioned, I think there's something like 71 million SMEs in ASEAN, and for many of them, they're trying to make sure that, year on year or month on month, that they're getting by and they're actually achieving their customers' needs. And whilst they are obviously keen to be part of this journey, they need it to be pragmatic, and they need it to be something that they can be part of. So having those tiers, particularly some of those lower tiers, which maybe aren't as appealing to somebody sitting in the EU or in some of the other regions, that's absolutely critical. And I think that's something which a lot of the working groups had fed back, that the client base that they were dealing with were struggling a little bit or feeling a little bit intimidated by the scale of the requests for sustainability or for transition plans. But actually this gives them that opportunity and gives them a timeline in which to go along. And I think, it was already mentioned earlier that, one of the things we're seeking from a lot of the companies that we're dealing with is a credible transition plan. And people talk a lot about transition finance and the importance of perhaps putting out capital and labeling it something either transition or sustainability linked, etc. But actually, I think the biggest risk issuers, corporates, borrowers have to think about is the potential that capital just goes away from them, that liquidity is not available. And a great example of that is the coal industry, for which many international institutions now are not willing to support. And the trick for high emitting industries, including steel and some of the other sectors that have already been mentioned, is to have a credible transition plan. And that credible transition plan buys you time and forgiveness, but also gives all your stakeholders a route or a view as to your route out of the current situation in terms of emissions. Now, the issue is always that sometimes it's not very obvious today exactly how a steel plant will decarbonize, particularly if it's sitting in a market where the power sources are not renewable or clean. But that's what the taxonomy does very well. It gives you a chance to go through the tiers and essentially develop as the technology develops. And it's a live document. It's something that actually supports changes in the market and changes in technology. I just want to make another comment about international operability. For international institutions like ours, it's really key that whatever's being developed in the ASEAN market does have some level of interoperability with other markets, BREMIOG, Japan in particular, but certainly with the other regions. And it's not to say that what's happening in ASEAN isn't unique and doesn't deserve certain criteria that may be different, but that interoperability point underlines a credibility point. So if the key for all of this is to be able to say this is still credible, then interoperability, I think, really helps to ensure that that is a valid case that's accepted by a lot of parties. So I'll leave it at that, Eugene.
Thank you very much, Shiv and Monica. You both raised the point about the credibility through interoperability and through the consistency in terms of the definitions. I think that's really key. And certainly the tiers in the transition finance guidance are very innovative, and they were subject to a lot of discussion to ensure that they would be relevant, useful, and actually credible enough, and at the same time be able to encourage the flow of capital to entities that need the finance. So it's really hard to get instant qualifiers for the 1.5 degree target, but there is a huge number of companies who can thrive over the well below 2. And as we work on these two segments, we also cannot ignore the companies who are trying to get to well below 2, but who are not there yet. So from a developmental angle and the SDGs, how useful, Peter, is the ASEAN Transition Finance version 2 for developing financial markets, leveraging capital markets, and importantly, getting that positive effect onto the real economy?
Thanks, Eugene, for this question. So in terms of development angle, which is, of course, crucial, not just for us as a development bank, but for everyone in ASEAN and beyond, the ATFG contributes quite a bit to furthering sustainable finance landscape in ASEAN. And building on the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance version 1, it in effect integrates seamlessly with the ASEAN taxonomy and provides a robust framework for driving climate action and hence also transition finance. And together these tools enable ASEAN economies and its financial market to support decarbonization pathways, which then in turn yield positive economic impacts. The guidance is also tailored to the region's specificities, which is crucial, providing practical support for an orderly, realistic, and just transition. In fact, it addresses the diversity of ASEAN economies and the reliance, as we heard, on carbon-intensive industries that will last for a bit longer, but at the same time ensuring transition pathways that are both feasible and also equitable. We also heard, and would like to echo that it really provides tools to corporates and financial institutions to assess and demonstrate credible transition plans, which is crucial, and supports also compliance with global sustainability standards, while also contributing to building investor confidence in ASEAN as a bloc. So, I mean, coming back to the mobilization of climate finance, capital markets, as mentioned, are very, very crucial and can play and must play an important, if not central role and catalytic role in attractive private sector climate finance investments. And the ATFG provides, of course, as mentioned, investors with a clear roadmap supporting credible transition initiatives and hence contributes mobilizing finance. Let me end this remarks with the just transition point one a little more. So the ATFG highlights the importance of a just, affordable, and green transition by addressing socioeconomic challenges, biodiversity considerations, all that are associated also with decarbonization. And it prioritizes solutions that are inclusive and equitable, very crucial, aiming to minimize disruptions in the form of during the transition, while also creating opportunities. So this approach, this coherent approach, ensures that communities and workers reliant on high carbon industries are provided actually with the necessary support and resources to adapt effectively during the transition. And hence, we expect that it also yields positive socioeconomic impacts and in fact also contributes to the SDGs. Over to you, Eugene.
Thank you, Peter. We are really looking at real world impact. Shiv, I need to ask you this question. You are the chair of the Taxonomy and Transition Working Group for the Industry Advisory Panel. And both you and Peter mentioned the ASEAN Taxonomy, and Peter had said that the ASEAN Taxonomy is ASEAN's anchor for sustainable finance. So it's always intended that the ASEAN Taxonomy and the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance will operate hand in hand. So how does the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance version 2 enable this? And apart from taxonomies, what else do you find useful in undertaking and demonstrating transitions? What do banks want to see?
No, thanks, Eugene. I think, you know, one of the reasons we've been so happy at MUFG to be involved in this process is that we know it's a moving feast in terms of what banks want to see and ultimately how the market is changing. And we also know that there are very few set rules or very few very clear guidelines, even from elsewhere in the world, as to what is gospel or what is absolutely set in stone for the next few years on these topics. If you really break it down, though, if you really look at what most financial institutions want, ultimately they are there to support investments into the real economy, whether they be debt or equity investments. They're very happy and committed to supporting the energy transition, and I think as responsible stakeholders in the markets they work in, most financial institutions feel that they should be supporting the energy transition for obvious reasons. However, because there's been such a dynamic, how do I put this? Views on what is considered acceptable can be quite dynamic. And I think that there are many examples of institutions perhaps putting out an instrument and saying this is a sustainability-linked loan or a transition bond or etc. for a company which is essentially high emitting but is reducing its emissions, and then being accused of, well, that's not acceptable, that's greenwashing. You're claiming that's transition or sustainability linked, but actually it's not. You're just supporting and locking in a company in an industry that, frankly, shouldn't be considered for green or transition type financing. And this has become a real problem. And what we've seen is a reduction in the volumes of sustainability-linked loans, sustainability-linked bonds in the last 12 months. Not only for this reason, because I think some of these markets have been a bit quieter, but because actually there has been a lot of concerns for financial institutions about whether or not they're doing the right thing when they're supporting certain companies in certain industries. So what I think most banks or institutions are looking for is air cover. And I think this is where the taxonomy and the guidance really helps. When I say air cover, it's something they can point to say, look, here is a set of rules. I know they're not exactly in line with perhaps the textbook or the ideal rules or the rules of certain other regions, but they work for this market. They work for the issuers and the borrowers and the companies in this market. And we're operating in this market and we think it's fair, and therefore we want to take this forward, and we are standing behind what we're doing in terms of transition financing or sustainability linked financing. And to be frank, it is, I cannot, you cannot underestimate the fear of greenwashing accusations. But unfortunately, those accusations do tend to come. They do tend to get quite blown up. And so for a lot of international institutions, it's really important that they have something they can stand behind. And that's where this taxonomy and this transition finance guidance, it really is critical in terms of supporting those discussions. But ultimately, the last point I'll make is banks are really keen to get things done. And Eugene, you and I have talked on separate occasions about the potential for ESG fatigue, or that people are maybe starting to feel that, look, we've been talking about some of these topics for a while, we're not seeing as much in action as we'd like to see. Ultimately, all the institutions out there, whether they be banks or FIs, are looking to try to make shareholder value. And they want to do it in the transition, they want to do it in sustainability, but they actually want to see credible deals that make sense for their clients, but also for their shareholders. And so I love the way the word pragmatism and the word practicality has been used throughout this conference, throughout this webinar, because I think that's now the theme, or it's been the theme of the last 12 months for most of the banks and financial institutions.
Thank you very much, Shiv. You know, in a world where we have to face contextualization, fragmentation, and greenwashing, we have to be very careful, and it is very important, therefore, to get that air cover. And of course, we also have to mind the paradox of ambition, because sometimes when ambition is too high, you're not going to achieve anything. I think this is a point that's really resonated in this conversation that we're having. Commissioner Brian talked about it, you talked about it. and it's something we definitely have to watch out for. So, Monica, AIGCC and Sophia have had this conversation before about how transition is not an easy area to address because it's really forward-looking and it's much harder to make evaluations and to reach investment decisions as a result. So what do you think the role of disclosures is, and how do you think disclosures can be most effective to facilitate transition finance? I mean, what do providers of capital want to see?
Sure. So just to start off with, you hear it over and over again about disclosure. And I try and explain why it is so important within the investors as well, and how it's kind of looked into as part of the portfolio as it evolves. Because at the end of the day, transition is really seeing the evolution in a way of how companies are progressing. So how do you track that progress and how do you bring it back to the investment decisions? I think that's kind of the key element. And underlining that all is that investors really, excuse me, rely on the public disclosures that companies make. So you have heard that many investors have integrated sustainability into the investment process. What that actually means is they're taking the disclosures that are provided by companies and really taking that in, whether it's sometimes it's by certain ratings, but it's not just the ratings itself, it's by many investors are actually looking at it on an individual company basis as well within the portfolio, and having a group of companies that they are looking into how the transition is made over time. Of course, there'll be elements of governance, there'll be elements of the different types of targets that are set by the companies, but also there are some elements that are a bit more forward-looking. So within the decarbonisation strategies of companies, where the capital allocation is going to be made and how that ties back to the strategies of the companies. So that's one of the key elements, and the ask as well. How is the alignment of, how is the board looking at it? And how is the structure of remuneration of directors or the management, how is that aligned? So it is an element where when you're looking into the revenues of the companies as well, that is fed back into how the directors or management are compensated as well. So that's another key element that is looked into. Also, there are other elements that, how is transition plans actually made by the companies? How is taken in over account? But also because realistically, a lot of the companies, they operate within a jurisdiction. So how the policies of that jurisdiction is really led and put forward is really, really important for the companies to actually progress as well. So we as investors have been engaging in the markets on specific topics, whether it's on energy transition or other adaptation or nature or other elements as well. But also the investors will increasingly look into how companies are engaging on the policy engagements within the jurisdictions as well. So you will see that assessment of tools coming out a bit more as you progress. There are specific areas and tools out there. The net zero company benchmark is one element that you can look into as an assessment and alignment tool, I would say. And the key element is that it's not a one-off assessment from the investors, it's a continuous assessment that happens over time. And it is an element where investors will internally set their internal targets, work with the companies, and see how the companies evolve over time in a period of time, whether that's a 3-year period or other period. It really depends on the investor, but they will want to see the progress over time as well. So I will leave it there for you.
Thank you very much. So basically, investors want to make informed decisions, and we have to give them the information to be able to do that. Brian, we have a couple of questions right down your alley. You might have seen them. So if I could just summarize and make them a bit more concise, basically, what are the regulators trying to do to harmonize the approaches for the region and to enable more capital to flow? And secondly, really, what are you trying to do from an international basis? So how globally interoperable is the ATFG version 2, and how is it being used as a transition finance tool? I've heard about this consortium comprising of the ACMF and the Working Committee on Capital Market Development, FSA Japan, and ADB, indeed, to establish a more robust approach to transition finance in Southeast Asia. Can you share with us a bit more about this?
Thanks, Eugene. You exactly read my mind. I was about to address a few of the questions on the chat box to the extent that it is very much relevant to the idea of interoperability. But also, just very quickly, there's also a question there on adaptation, and just to give my 2 cents on that, my thinking is, of course, definitely when you integrate adaptation measures, you build resilience, you reduce vulnerabilities, and you basically reduce vulnerabilities of an entity to climate disruptions, which of course contributes to continued business operations. I think goes into business continuity, and that, and albeit informally, even at the ACMF level, discussions on this have already started. So on your question, Eugene, and I'd like to somehow dissect them into 3 parts. One is, of course, in terms of interoperability, the ATFG is not intended to supplant any of the existing frameworks. In fact, we are working with, or we started from existing global frameworks and worked on them to ensure maximum applicability at the ASEAN context. If you look at the GFAN's, the 4 strategies of the GFAN's, ideas of aligned and aligning, these are ideas that are similarly found in the ATFG, and albeit the fact that we've already, and of course this resulted in the formulation of the 3 tiers to ensure that we are factoring the local nuances at the ASEAN, and also very much cognizant of the diversity in the respective maturity levels of the AMS. The adjustments or the similarities that the ATFG has made or has embodied in its current version or even in version 1, I guess also brings about the idea of equivalence. And definitely we want to allow as much entities to access financing, not just in the ASEAN, but also beyond. And so we have adapted that principle of equivalence. And I think this also goes or tries to, this is also responsive to the question on whether the efforts at the regional level somehow disrupts local efforts to contextualize. But I'd like to think that our efforts at the regional level, rather than disrupting, is actually more of providing further guidance as we develop our frameworks domestically. In a country such as, just a case in point, in the Philippines, when we're still grappling with taxonomy and trying to inculcate this to our entities, and trying to learn about transition and transition finance, having that regional benchmark or regional formulation assists us in learning more and more, and bringing this idea into the consciousness of our own constituents. And so my thinking is, rather than disrupting, it is more complementing domestic efforts. You've also mentioned, how is this ATFG being used as a transition tool? I guess one, definitely it identifies entities that contribute to the whole of economy transition, whether you are aligned or aligning to the 1.5, well below 2, or having a progressive tier. It gives you visibility to investors and financial institutions that may unlock much needed finance for your own transition plan. Also, this is not to say, and I think this is very important, that ATFG in itself is not a a standalone tool. It can actually be used side by side with the taxonomy, especially when you develop our ASEAN taxonomy, your versions 3, and now we're going our version 4. We're studying the technical screening criteria. So we have definite thresholds, sunset periods that would aid us in bringing in more investor confidence. Finally, you've also mentioned the Asia GX Consortium. Last October of 2024, we formally launched the Asia GX Consortium, which is, of course, with JFSA, the Japan Financial Services Agency, and the ASEAN as a block, where we tried or we attempt to arrive at common approaches, practical at that, to transition finance, considering the ASEAN context, and explore ways to promote transition finance flows in Japan. It's significant that the Asia GX makes reference to the ASEAN taxonomy, as well as the ATFG. My thinking personally is the fact that we have peers in the region or neighboring jurisdictions coming in and touching base with the ASEAN and forging this collaboration to arrive at common approaches affirms the credibility of what we have achieved so far.
Thank you very much. So exciting things ahead for transition finance in Southeast Asia. And importantly, ATFG is not just a piece of paper, it's being put to real life work. So that's really heartening to hear. Peter, I'll just come back to the big picture that you talked about just now, which is just transitions and the associated need to mobilize climate and transition finance. So we've heard from the other speakers. I'm wondering if you could help us summarize how the ATFG can help achieve this goal. And now that the ATFG has been published in its second incarnation, what do we need to do next to move the dial?
Thanks so much, Eugene. As briefly mentioned earlier, just transition really plays a crucial role in transitioning from carbon-intensive economies to more renewable and sustainable ones, as we aim for. And just transition encompasses really the entire societal shift, if you want, toward a low-carbon economy, ensuring fairness throughout the process to achieve equitable and inclusive outcomes. And in fact, the ATFG really embraces that. It also focuses on a just transition. Further, the ATFG is also aligned with ADB's Energy Transition Mechanism, ETM, a flagship initiative, demonstrating how high carbon energy sources can be phased out early while considering carefully socioeconomic inclusivity and minimizing disruptions, supporting affected communities in the process of transition. So very much so, the ATFG provides a guidance on all that to assure a fair, just, and equitable transition. So what's important, of course, and I'd also like to say a few things on the need for adoption or embracing it wider now since the version 2 has been, consulted, refined, and published. It really offers a really structured approach, enabling ASEAN countries aligning the national approaches, supporting a more coordinated and effective strategy for transition finance. But there's more to be done. And of course, one of which is capacity building that remains essential at all levels. Governments, policymakers, regulators, crucially the private sector, they must embrace and be equipped to properly apply ASEAN transition finance guidance confidently and effectively so that it does also is fully embraced and doesn't appear like, say, yet a document that is sort of causing headache, but instead really be useful and effectively applied and utilized. So on that front, the private sector engagement, of course, is always key to application and also to scaling up climate finance. I said that earlier, but I also like to mention that the stakeholder engagement that has been ongoing, including the development of that guidance, is really, really crucial. And I'd like to echo that the initiatives like the Asia GX Consortium that is also supported by ADB highlights how partnership can really foster knowledge sharing. But not only that, but really also drive innovation, drive convergence, drive adoption, and also drive interoperability eventually of the transition finance frameworks beyond ASEAN. So moving forward, I mean, there's a lot to be done, of course, always. But ADB, of course, remains fully committed to supporting ACMF, and more generally also our developing member countries in advancing transition finance frameworks. Through our continued partnership, we really aim to translate the tools and frameworks of the ATFG into practical and tangible outcomes, eventually contributing to sustainable inclusive growth in ASEAN. Thank you, Eugene. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much. So we have some questions, but we're also running out of time. So perhaps what I'd like to do is to now talk about how we can help transitions succeed. Because to help transitions succeed, we also need to leverage on other enablers and to incorporate related issues. And we heard about one of them just now, which is adaptation. So I just want to go around to all the speakers for a quick rundown on what they feel are the other elements we should consider to make transitions successful. And perhaps I can start with you, Shiv.
Yeah, sure. I'll keep it short because conscious of time. I know there's a lot of things that we can say here, and there's a lot of mechanisms out there, but I'll be a bit simplistic. This might be a cop out, and I'll just say that pragmatism. Let's just focus on more and more pragmatism, and I think accepting that certain institutions maybe are trying to reduce their emissions, trying to do the right thing, perhaps not hitting all the levels that we prefer. Let's just accept that it's better than nothing, and that at least we get people going on this journey using these guidelines, using this taxonomy, and then we can take it further as people get used to it and start to understand it and technology opens up. So for me, it's just more of a mindset thing. Just keep the pragmatism going, and let's not demonize industries or players who are trying to do the right thing.
Thank you very much. Good advice. We should always remember in developing things, practicality. Monica?
Sure. One of the things I would probably address is the funding gap that was up in the question as well. So I try and address that while closing off as well. So for the funding gap, the large billions of funds that are needed were mentioned. The availability of funds were also mentioned. But it is the flow of capital I think we need to work on a lot more, the implementation of it. From the investor side, there is certain elements where transition has been very focused on a deal-by-deal basis. Now that has to be taken on a larger scale for the scale and speed to actually happen. We are working on it ourselves, and many of the others are working on this as well. So there's work to be done, I would say, from the companies and corporate side, from the investor side, but also working with the governments as well. So really focusing on the need of how to implement the scale and speed will be critical in the coming years.
Right. Thank you very much. Yes, I think this deal-by-deal approach is certainly something that we need to enhance because we do need to look at economy-wide transitions. Brian.
Yeah. Thanks, Eugene. Just touch on two things very quickly. One is I think she mentioned about air cover, and definitely I am one with acquire. Definitely there's that regulators buy-in. Maybe through related policies and issuances. There's also the role of regulators to continue to engage industry. And I think that's also something that's very important in how we have crafted our versions of the ATFG, as well as even in the taxonomy, to ensure that stakeholders are engaging closely with their domestic constituents. There's a role of convening industry also as part of promoting our efforts in this space. Definitely, when you have your credibility, when you have your regulators buy-in, you add credibility to the guidance that we are formulating. And then just I just want to touch on the issue of MSMEs in a region where MSMEs are 44.5% of GDP. 85% of employment. I'm looking at my cheat sheet. I don't want to be misquoted. But in the Philippines, where MSMEs comprise about 99% of all our entities and also roughly 60+% of our labor, it's also high time to get them aboard the bandwagon and introduce these concepts. Of course, while we start with our bigger entities, our publicly listed entities, they're all part of the supply chain. And definitely they have their respective emissions. And then we can also support little by little their efforts towards transition. So that's for me, Eugene.
Thanks, Combrand. Combrand, as I read the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance, I see that it's very much geared towards MSMEs actually. And I think that's really important, because if you don't support the MSMEs, you really can't support larger companies and they can't achieve their targets as well. So it's really an important aspect. What about carbon offsets, Combrand? Are the regulators looking at that?
Yeah, so definitely even at the ICMF level, we have efforts to study the voluntary carbon markets, and of course one sticking point is really also for various jurisdictions to maybe have some national support, maybe through legislation or maybe support from other government agencies. But definitely even at the ACMF level, we see this as another tool as part of all our sustainability-related initiatives.
Thank you very much. That's a very important aspect of transitions as well. So Peter, you get the final word.
Thanks, Eugene. And I think thanks. And I couldn't agree more with everything what all the other panelists have said. And probably we could craft another wonderful webinar just with this open question at the end, Eugene. So, but let me be brief and first picking up the point on the carbon markets. So the introduction of carbon markets, I feel, really offers a game-changing potential, because ultimately, I mean, it would allow for internalizing this negative externality of carbon emissions being wrongly priced and putting the right price on it, trading it, and so forth. So, and also in that regard, the regional nature or the cross-border nature of carbon market is crucial. I'm not saying it's simple, but it's definitely crucial and essential given the public good nature of climate change. So it's not a national issue, it's a regional or if not global issue, of course. And an important step forward, as mentioned by Commissioner, is the recent publication of an ACMF report that we also are pleased to support on voluntary carbon markets in ACMF, in ASEAN. So I would like to invite everyone to have a look. And final words, Eugene, biodiversity and nature finance. I mean, these are partially covered in these wonderful ongoing efforts, such as the taxonomy. But perhaps we could think of how to a bit deeper into it. So biodiversity and nature finance are really vital for preserving ecosystems, but also crucial for climate goals. So if you think, for example, of integrating adaptation measures, ensuring that communities remain resilient in the face of climate impacts can make a difference. And so one potential consideration for future could be broadening our transition efforts and jointly think about potentially developing nature transition plans for consideration.
Well, thank you very much,
so
Peter.
much.
I think you've read the ACMF's mind. There has been some discussion about how we can incorporate nature in transition plans. So I guess ADB will be supporting that as well. With that, I wanted to thank Monica, Shiv, Brian, and Peter for their wonderful insights. It's been a really enriching session for me, and I've learned a lot today. So thank you very much. And with that, let me hand back over to Don.
Thank you, Eugene, and of course, our distinguished panelists, Commissioner Brian, Peter, Monica, and Shiv. Indeed, we have heard how transition is still relevant in ASEAN and globally. We have also heard the journey of the guidance to becoming a framework that addresses the needs of the ASEAN region while remaining interoperable to other global frameworks. There's more to be done, but with continued intra and inter-regional collaborations, as we just heard, there is certainty that the ASEAN is headed towards the right direction to truly accelerate transition finance in ASEAN. With that, we have Chair of the ACMF 2025 Securities Commission Malaysia, represented by Managing Director Datin Paduka Azalina Adham. Datin Paduka Azalina brings with her 23 years of diverse financial and capital market experience in investment banking, corporate finance, as well as the exchange business, having previously served as Chief Operating Officer of Bursa Malaysia Berhad before joining the Securities Commission. She also previously worked in investment banks in Malaysia as well as an independent non-executive director on the board of several publicly listed companies in Malaysia, as well as a Ministry of Finance Incorporated company.
Secretary General Madam Feng Si Feng Wang of the Laos Securities Commission Office, distinguished chairs, SFWG Co-Chair Commissioner Brian Fernandez of the Philippines SEC, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and Happy New Year. First and foremost, on behalf of the SC Malaysia, I would like to thank all of you for taking the time to join us today. I hope you found the sessions engaging and insightful, given the importance of transition finance in shaping a sustainable future for ASEAN. Transition finance is an essential tool to provide companies and ecosystems a clear pathway towards a more sustainable and low-carbon economy. Although ASEAN only contributes less than 10% of global CO2 emissions, unchecked climate change will have a significant impact on ASEAN. According to the ASEAN Strategy for Carbon Neutrality, the region runs the risk of an estimated 11% of GDP loss by 2100. It also needs up to $6.7 trillion to transition by 2050. So today's discussion emphasized the importance of ensuring the transition to a sustainable economy that is just, inclusive, affordable, and equitable. This is particularly important for ASEAN region, which is economically diverse and at varying stages of development. We have developed, developing, and frontier markets amongst us. In order to make certain that our frontier member states can capitalize on their rapid development potential, we must ensure that they are not left behind in the transition journey as well. Given the rise of issues such as greenwashing and challenges of inclusivity and interoperability, companies need greater clarity and guidance to begin their transition journeys. Hence, the second version of the ASEAN Transition Finance Guide hopes to provide a clear method to augment and adapt existing transition pathways for individual circumstances. This will help strike a crucial balance between flexibility and facilitating a credible transition, ultimately ensuring continued access to funding for companies in the region. Of course, the work does not end here. As we leave this seminar and webinar, I encourage each of you to reflect on your own role in advancing ASEAN's transition journey. Whether you're a policymaker, a financier, entrepreneur, or advocate, your presence here signals a shared commitment towards driving meaningful change. A just transition requires collective action and collective effort for us to truly encourage adoption. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing the progress we will be achieving together. Thank you.
With the webinar closed, on behalf of the ACMF, allow me to thank our distinguished speakers and all of you, our participants, for joining us today. We hope that you bring with you valuable knowledge in transition finance in the region. We also thank Sophia for organizing today's event, giving us a platform to share our initiatives. With that, take care, stay safe, and we hope to see you in the next webinar.